The desert sun baked the tarmac at Nevatim Air Base as a roar of jet engines sliced through the arid morning air. A line of American-made F-35 fighter jets shimmered beneath the heat, their matte gray skins hiding far more than their sleek silhouettes let on. For the first time in decades, the quiet understanding between two distant democracies had transformed into something unmistakable. Preparation for the unthinkable. Captain Aaron West, a 36-year-old U.S. Air Force officer, had landed in Israel 2 weeks ago, embedded within a joint task force that, until recently, didn't exist. He was experienced in advanced weapon systems and had overseen THAAD deployments in Guam and South Korea. But this time felt different. Not only was the United States supplying Israel with defensive weapons, it was also discussing deployment scenarios for nuclear-capable aircraft. And Aaron, an American on Israeli soil, had just received orders that had his hands trembling as he folded the envelope shut. Across the airfield, Brigadier General Yossi Halperin, a former F-15 pilot turned senior IA planner, watched as maintenance crews rolled a newly modified bomb cart onto the tarmac. The payload wasn't live yet, but it was designed for a nuclear gravity bomb. An American B-61-12 mock-up sat atop the frame, inert but heavy with implications. Yossi, once a believer that conventional warfare would define Israel's future, now found himself balancing between deterrence and escalation, and he hated that the needle was pointing further toward the latter with each passing month. The shift had been sudden, almost violent in its political urgency. In late 2024, after a series of escalatory incidents, ballistic missile launches from Iranian proxies in Syria, suspected enrichment spikes in Natanz, and a drone attack on a U.S. warship in the Gulf, the White House moved to reinforce its nuclear deterrence commitments, not to NATO, not to the Pacific, but to Israel. The rhetoric changed. We have to prepare for Russia, they now said, invoking Kremlin's expanded support for Iran, including transfer of advanced S-400 systems and ISR capabilities. The U.S. Pentagon quietly greenlit deployment options that hadn't been seriously considered in decades. A portion of the B-61 stockpile stored in Europe was suddenly relocated, not to American air bases in Germany or Turkey, but to special storage facilities in Israel under a policy framework so ambiguous it offered both nations deniability and readiness. For the first time, Israeli fighter jets, namely the F-15IRM and select F-35I Adirs, were being evaluated not just for compatibility with American targeting protocols, but for full nuclear delivery readiness. Inside a secured conference room at Tel Aviv's Kiryat military headquarters, a joint command meeting was underway. Israeli and American officers pored over mission plans, satellite imagery, and timing protocols. Captain West sat beside a digital map glowing with concentric red rings indicating Iranian missile ranges. Yossi stood near the screen, pointing toward Bandar Abbas. If they move as condors into western Iran, he said, we'll have 6 minutes, maybe less. A young Israeli intelligence officer, Lieutenant Miriam Regev, typed rapidly on her tablet, updating a threat matrix that was evolving faster than anyone was comfortable admitting. She had spent the last few months tracking logistics movements around Tehran and was now cross-referencing data on North Korean advisors rumored to be helping Iran accelerate missile silo hardening. Her voice was calm, but her data wasn't. There's now a 68% likelihood they'll deploy launchers near Hamadan. That gives them direct reach to Dimona, that one name, the location of Israel's long-assumed but unacknowledged nuclear facility, hung heavy in the room. Meanwhile, debates in Washington were heating up. Not everyone supported this deepening entanglement. Senator Albright from Oregon called it a reckless merging of sovereign deterrence. Others argued it was about time the U.S. acknowledged its most important allies' existential threats. But the numbers told a clearer story. Over $1 billion in missile defense support in just 2 years, and now a further 20% of the Pentagon's THAAD stockpile redeployed. The Senate wasn't merely watching, many were fueling it. Back at Nevatim, the silence in the hangar was broken only by the hum of power tools. Captain West stepped closer to the F-35I, now partially disassembled for a weapon systems integration test. He traced his fingers along the bomb rack mount. Once used for dams and anti-runway munitions, it would soon carry something far heavier in meaning. He looked up and caught General Halperin's eyes. Neither man smiled. "I joined the Air Force to prevent this," Aaron muttered. Yossi nodded. "So did I. And yet, here we are, preparing for it." Their handshake wasn't symbolic. It was a gesture of two professionals acknowledging that diplomacy was losing altitude fast, and that deterrence, however grim, was now their job. That evening, as dusk settled over the desert and the final crew inspection wrapped up, a C-17 cargo plane rumbled into view, taxiing toward the cordoned-off munitions zone. Inside, it carried two more pallets, labeled only with numbers, but guarded like the keys to hell. And far beyond Israeli skies, in Moscow, an alert rang quietly inside Russia's National Defense Management Center. Their analysts had noticed the repositioning. The Kremlin didn't blink often, but this time it might. Whether it would flinch or strike first was still anyone's guess. The fuse, it seemed, was being built before everyone's eyes, and all it needed now was a spark. In a secure hangar nestled deep within the Negev Desert, the buzz of clandestine activity intensified as preparations entered their final phase. General Yossi Halperin stood beneath the shadow of an Israeli F-15I RAM, flanked by American and Israeli engineers adjusting the aircraft's modified bomb release systems. Every action taken inside the hangar was a silent echo of urgency. Precision, secrecy, and control were paramount. The B-61 mock-ups had arrived not merely as a symbol of deterrence, but as a working template. Now the transition from theory to execution hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Captain Aaron West found himself slipping into a role that felt more like liaison and less like observer. Back in Washington, his orders had been clear: oversee and report. But as briefing after briefing unveiled just how deep the collaboration was becoming, Aaron realized he wasn't reporting anymore. He was facilitating. The Americans weren't merely handing over weapon systems. They were shaping doctrine. Through mission simulations, electronic warfare exercises, and low-altitude integration drills, the U.S. was hardwiring nuclear interoperability into Israel's combat architecture. As days bled into nights, the Joint Command Center at Nevedem became the crucible of strategic evolution. Satellite feeds flicker across wide screens, showing transport convoys, launch silos, and radar sites deep inside Iran's Zagros Mountains. Russian technicians were confirmed at multiple sites. Evidence pointed to dual-use launch systems capable of firing both conventional and nuclear warheads. One such installation near Kermanshah had gone live only days before. Yossi studied the imagery in silence before finally speaking. "They're preparing for the option we've been trying to avoid." Back in the operations module, Lieutenant Miriam Regev worked methodically through intercept log cyber penetration reports and human transmissions from covert assets. Her data showed that Iran had dramatically increased the pace of its long-range missile drills, launching multiple Shahed 237s with simulated payloads. These drills, cloaked as defensive readiness, were alarmingly aligned with nuclear delivery timelines. Miriam hesitated before bringing her report to the briefing table, aware that her assessment might accelerate the push toward deployment readiness. Still, her voice remained steady. "They're rehearsing, and we believe the launch crews are practicing timed warhead mating." The statement hung in the room like a fog. Across from her, Aaron noted the immediate tightening of jaws and narrowing of eyes. He had seen it before in Korea and in Germany, too. It was the expression soldiers wore when political uncertainty started to bleed into their orders. Outside, under the harsh desert sun, the ground crews continued loading defensive platforms. THAAD batteries, normally deployed in fixed high-altitude positions, had been adapted for mobile response within Israeli territory. Over 20% of America's strategic THAAD inventory had now been stationed in or near Israel, each battery capable of intercepting advanced ballistic threats at over 150 kilometers. This wasn't just a show of solidarity. It was layered defense in action. But there were limits even to defense. That was the core of the new problem. Israeli doctrine had always prioritized swift, overwhelming retaliation to existential threats. The inclusion of U.S. nuclear hardware, technically on loan, theoretically still under American command, blurred red lines that had once been clear. Who had the final say on release? Could Israel act without U.S. approval if under imminent threat? And would the presence of American weapons deter or provoke Iran into preemptive action? Aaron met with Israeli pilots daily now, many of whom had trained at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. They were elite, smart, and increasingly uneasy. One pilot, called Sign Viper, spoke candidly as they walked the perimeter of the airstrip. You spend your life learning how to hit targets without being seen. Now we're being told we might carry something that everyone must see. It's not a stealth mission anymore, it's a warning shot. That night, a simulated alert rattled the base. At 0200 hours, an inbound missile scenario was projected. 2 IRGC Qaim-class projectiles targeting Haifa and Tel Aviv. Crews scrambled, radars lit up, and THAAD interceptors were armed. The simulation was cleared within minutes, but the tension lingered. In the debrief, Yossi reminded everyone that next time it might not be a drill. We don't want war, he said plainly, but we must look like we're ready to win one. Back in Washington, dissent flared. Media outlets broke the story of the B-61's quiet deployment. Some praised the strategy as a masterstroke of deterrence. Others condemned it as reckless nuclear brinkmanship. The White House refused comment, sticking to the line that no new nuclear weapons have been transferred. But analysts quickly dissected satellite footage and procurement logs. The truth, while murky, was unavoidable. The U.S. was preparing Israel for a nuclear-capable strike role, and the world knew it. Tensions weren't only rising abroad. Inside the Pentagon, internal debates raged over whether extending nuclear capability to non-NATO allies violated existing treaties. Quietly, however, Pentagon insiders acknowledged that necessity was outweighing legality. The real question was no longer if these capabilities would be used, but when deterrence might fail. By week's end, Israeli Prime Minister Ben David and U.S. Secretary of Defense Roland Green issued a joint statement. It was filled with language like strategic equilibrium, defensive integration, and unbreakable partnership. But beneath the diplomatic polish, the message was unmistakable. Together, the U.S. and Israel were preparing for a worst-case scenario, and they expected it might arrive sooner than later. As another red sun dipped beneath the Negev horizon, casting long shadows over the camouflaged warplanes, Aaron stood watching from the flight tower. He thought of home, of his wife and son back in Nevada, and of the solemnity of his oath, not to provoke war, not to invite destruction, but to be ready. What haunted him now wasn't the presence of a bomb. It was a clarity that, for the first time in his career, they were preparing for the day they might have to use it. A stillness settled over the Negev as the sandstorm subsided, but inside the hardened bunkers of the base, silence was not peace. It was pressure. Every move now had the weight of consequence. The integration phase had ended. The simulation drills had passed. The policy debates had quieted into something far more ominous, readiness. And with readiness came questions no one wanted to answer out loud. General Yossi Halperin sat alone in the war room, the flickering screens casting a ghostly blue over his furrowed brow. An encrypted communique had just arrived from Tel Aviv. Final authorization for the nuclear-capable patrols had been granted. From this point forward, Israeli strike aircraft would fly operational missions under a nuclear readiness protocol. No payloads would be loaded yet, but the message was unmistakable. Israel was showing the world, and Iran, that the next step was not theoretical. Captain Aaron West watched from a nearby hangar as 2 F-59 RAM jets taxied into position for a night patrol. Their pilots, Viper and Shade, had spent the last week rehearsing flight profiles under strict U.S.-Israeli Joint Command oversight. These were not ordinary missions. Each sortie was an act of calibrated deterrence, a signal in the sky that Israel's options now extended into the nuclear threshold. Aaron couldn't shake the feeling in his gut, the sense that something irreversible had happened, and he had helped midwife it into being. Yet he also knew, rationally, that deterrence worked not in silence, but in spectacle. What you could do mattered less than what your enemy believed you would do. Far beyond the desert, over the waters of the Persian Gulf, Iranian radar operators tracked the sudden uptick in aerial movements. Their analysts, fluent in American and Israeli flight patterns, understood immediately that these weren't standard recon flights. The altitude was different, the formations tighter, the electronic signature cleaner. Tehran's own generals met that night, poring over intercepted signals and decrypted chatter, debating whether what they were seeing was real preparation or a bluff. Inside Israel, the government began quietly prepping its emergency communication infrastructure. Secure broadcast networks were tested. Civil defense protocols reviewed. None of this was made public. But the shadows knew. Mossad briefed its foreign counterparts. European allies asked subtle questions behind closed doors. And NATO, though not directly involved, raised its alert posture in southern Europe. Back on base, Lieutenant Miriam Regev continued intercepting communications that confirmed her earlier suspicions. IRGC missile units near Bandar Abbas were now operating under high alert procedures. Mobile launchers were repositioning. Fueling drills increased. This wasn't a drill, it was a dance. One false note, and the whole performance could end in fire. That evening, General Halpern and Captain West met in the command center. Neither spoke at first. The air between them was dense with mutual understanding. Finally, Yossi broke the silence. "We've crossed the Rubicon, haven't we?" Aaron nodded. "We've lit a match. Now we just pray it doesn't find the powder." Then, like clockwork, it happened. At 3:17 a.m., Israeli early warning systems picked up a launch signature over western Iran. Within seconds, it was confirmed. 2 Shahab-class ballistic missiles, trajectory unknown. A second wave followed within minutes. Negev scrambled. THAAD and Arrow batteries locked in. This wasn't a drill. This was live. As sirens wailed across central Israel, Aaron ran to the operations center. The command staff moved like surgeons. Cold, focused, exact. THAAD interceptors roared into the sky. One by one, the Iranian missiles were neutralized mid-flight, erupting into brief suns above the atmosphere. But one made it past the upper tier. It fell into open terrain near Beersheba. No casualties, just a crater. It was enough. Within minutes, the Prime Minister was on the line. No one knew what Iran would claim, whether this was a test, a warning, or an accidental launch. But to Israel, a red line had been crossed. The cabinet convened in an underground facility, reviewing pre-drafted retaliation options. Each plan came with a grim cost. Each path forward risked dragging the region into a cataclysm. Back at base, pilots were already in their cockpits. Jets fueled, armed, ready. Aaron stood beside General Halpern, eyes fixed on the board. "Will we strike?" he asked quietly. Yossi didn't answer. He stared at the screen, then turned away, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Finally, a secure call came through from Washington. The president's voice was firm. "Do not escalate until confirmation. We'll handle the diplomatic track, but maintain readiness." The order stopped the retaliation. For now, as dawn broke, Israel issued a formal condemnation and elevated its alert level. Iran, for its part, denied responsibility, claiming a rogue faction had acted independently. A convenient lie, perhaps, but one that allowed the world to step back from the brink, if only temporarily. In the days that followed, the skies above the Negev remained busy. Patrols continued. Drills intensified. But the weapons remained undelivered. The B-61S stayed in secure bunkers, inert yet omnipresent. Aaron would later write in his journal, "We walked to the edge and didn't jump, but the wind is still blowing strong." The world had changed. Israel now flew with a new kind of shield and a new kind of sword. What remained was the hope that neither would ever be used. But hope, as history had often shown, was not a strategy. It was only the space between conflict and catastrophe.